thank you everyone for joining us for the second L&D drop-in. If you couldn't join us last time, the premise is that we're going to tackle one big subject for an hour and have four guests join us for 15 minutes each to share their best advice. So as you would have seen from the title and kind of the reason you signed up, it is with the idea of tackling the skills crisis or how we can solve it. The numbers keep ever increasing every time I see the amount of people that need to be reskilled by a certain date. But the latest I saw was 1 billion people by 2030. So obviously it's very pressing. And the idea of this session is to give you some practical advice so that you can go away and get ahead of all of this. So like I said, it's going to be roughly 15 minutes each. We'll cover quite a lot, so we might not have time for questions or Q&A, but please do drop any into the chat when they come to you, because if we do have time, we can put them to our guests. And if we don't have time, we can always just follow up maybe with a newsletter or email that has all of this in it. So without further ado, Joelle, over to you. Tell us very quickly who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Joelle, and I have my own business called Blendible, and I support organisations with their digital learning and blended learning approach. So I've done some work with HSBC, with Greater Manchester Police, and before that I was employed by AO, who, if you're not from the UK, they're a online retailer, and Aldi, the supermarket as well.
If you are from the UK, you'll know that AO has one of the most catchy songs from an advert that gets stuck in your head every
Hard
time.
not to sing it, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Joelle, a great starting point is aligning your L&D efforts to business objectives. So why is that? What's some of the advice around how we can do it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think traditionally L&D has been seen quite separate from the business, not always by the L&D team. We kind of think we're involved in it, but then the rest of the business is kind of seen L&D as doing their own thing. Often it's been a case of L&D being like, I think the organisation needs this piece of learning, so we'll create something, or this programme, so we'll create it, or sometimes from a learning needs analysis, and often from departments coming to the learning team and saying, we need something on this, can you support us? But that is changing, and it's becoming more and more important for L&D to be showing how they're investing in the business and how they're supporting the business to reach their objectives. So it's really key for us in the L&D team, where things are getting tighter, where budgets are getting tighter, where teams are getting smaller, to be proving that we are supporting the organisation to reach its objectives rather than kind of setting our own objectives from the L&D team. We need to be speaking their language. We need to be supporting them and really integrated as part of the business for the organisation to be reaching those goals.
And I know sort of the advice for that is really to get to the bottom of what the business strategy is. So is there anything that you've seen really work for understanding what that overall strategy is and what the goals are?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds obvious when I say it, but it's to ask the business, and it's quite often missed. It's so often in organisations that I've worked in, I've seen where the L&D team are assuming what the business needs, or doing a learning needs analysis that's very channeled to what they want to be creating anyway, and kind of biased on that point. But we need to be asking the business, going to department leads, even if it's just a conversation, to understand what it is, but asking for documents as well. So getting the business strategy documents and using that to map out what it is that's required, what skills are going to be required, and asking individual teams what their objectives are, so that even if they do come to us and say we need some learning on time management, we can directly connect that with how that's going to make that team successful, rather than just taking it at face value as a time management course, so that we can tailor it for that team and for the organization's success.
Yeah, I know when we spoke before, you mentioned that, the closer you are to the strategy, the easier it is to spot the skills we need and the gaps we have.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take a business strategy or a business planning document, there are kind of two main ways that it can help us to build our L&D strategies to support the business. So there's kind of the immediate skills need. So I give you an example. One of the organizations I worked in, they had put in their business strategy for the overall UK business that they wanted to cut costs by 25% over a year, with every single employee, no matter what department you're in, focusing on how they could save money. So we used that information to produce short videos on how to cut costs in the office, in the warehouse. It was a series of videos depending on the audience. So in that sense, cost cutting was a business need, and creating that learning directly supported the organization to achieve its goals, which helped build the relationship between the business and the L&D team. But also we could use the data that the business were already collecting on cost cutting to show how our learning was supporting them. So there's kind of that immediate skills need, but then there's also a long-term skills need that we can look at as well. So for example, another client that I worked with had built into their business strategy that they wanted more women working in the business. It was an organization where it was very male dominated. I think it was in one particular department, I think it was something like 97% male. And although initially that doesn't sound like a skills requirement, we could use that strategy to do a thorough analysis, a real discovery phase, to find out that many of the men in the organization, because they were in such a male dominated industry, were lacking skills in how to deal with women, and they were actually scared about women coming into their department because they felt that they were going to misstep or say something wrong or brush past them in the corridor and it was going to cause an issue. So we used that to create a campaign for upskilling and confidence building in that area, and that was how we used that kind of piece of the strategy document to address a skill that was going to support the business in the future and help to support closing that skills gap. So the business strategy isn't an LNA in itself, but it gives a really good idea of where to focus an LNA, as well as giving us more obvious examples of skills we can support. And sorry, I shouldn't use abbreviations without saying what it is first. A learning needs analysis. But yeah, it can give us more obvious examples of skills we can support with, as well as that long-term strategy for closing a skills gap.
I know we'd kind of mentioned this as a point we wanted to get to anyway, but was there anything else you wanted to share around the idea of that skills analysis part that's linked directly to the business objective?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned to you, Gary, about using large language models like ChatGPT or like Copilot for supporting with skills analysis that can support the business. So tools like that are fantastic for shortcuts in areas that can take months, sometimes even years. I've seen many times skills mapping where it's taken over a year to map out all of the roles and the skills and get it all signed off by the business for it to then just show that it's wrong after a year because everything's changed. So if we can shorten that process, then it can really help. So there is a GPT called Skills GPT, and I'm sure there are many other ones as well, but this is just the one that I've used, where you can ask it what the skills crisis looks like for your particular organization, and you can use that to map it against business objectives. I haven't actually tried this, but I bet you could upload your business strategy document or business planning document and ask it to create a skills map that addresses the skills crisis. Obviously, it would need tweaking and bespoking, but it probably is an option. And I was going to share my screen to just show an example of how we can use it very quickly, just kind of as a practical example. Am I the host now, Gary?
Just made you the host, yeah.
All right, fab. Can you see my screen? Yeah, good, fab. So this is Skills GPT, and I did actually write one out earlier, so you weren't all sitting watching me type on it. That's the so yeah, so you weren't all kind of sitting watching me type it out. But let me get it here. Oh, sorry. This isn't the thing I was talking about earlier for like a digital person.
Yeah.
I'm going to use this
Preempted
one. And actually, I'm going to put it in for Aldi because it's a little bit more well known. So you can do your prompt however detailed or simple as you like. Because if you do it simple, if you're not used to using GPT and you want to make it really simple, it will guide you through the information that it needs to be able to come up with it. Or you can, if you know a lot about your skills mapping already and the skills needed in your organization, then you can put a lot of detail in for the prompt. So this one I've put in is create a skills map that addresses the skills crisis for my organization. And I've just said that we're working at Aldi because it's a well-known organization. The skills map should identify which skills are currently required for each role in each department, which skills will be needed in 5 years, which skills will be needed in 10 years, and what proficiency level out of 5 is required for each role. So if I send that, so it's asking for more information. So if I was to put in here that the departments are retail operations and logistics and corporate and buying and procurement. Then it could come up with different roles listing each of those areas. And as you can see, it kind of guides you through being able to come up with the list of roles. You can give it more and more information. And then eventually it will come up with a list of the skills that are needed in each one for what you've requested. So in 5 years, in 10 years. And then you can send those off to your departments. I'm going to stop sharing now. You can send those off to the department leads or to if HR have got a good structure where they're connected with it. And you can even probably upload HR system documents into there as well to give it a good idea of it. And that will give you a starting base for being able to map out those skills and understand what is needed.
Perfect. And then very quickly, I've just got one last question for you. You mentioned to me before about building a marketing campaign around skills so that people can see the value in it, they're bought in, they're invested. So kind of what is the top level advice for doing that?
Yeah, so sometimes what's the problem is that in L&D we can create these amazing things, and we can be aligning it to the business strategy, really supporting the business. But if the organization don't know that the learning is there, or they've forgotten because they've only seen one email about it, then it means that we're not supporting the business at all. People need to be taking the learning, they need to be doing the learning for it to be effective. So it's just kind of on that basis, it needs to be a campaign. And again, you can use GPT to create a campaign for you around your learning if you're putting the right prompts in, and then utilize that on your learning platform or wherever it is. So yeah, it's just about making sure that people really know about the learning so that they're taking the learning and that they are invested in it by us telling them what is in it for them. So sometimes that's as simple as them understanding how them being upskilled in this particular topic is going to contribute to the business. It's quite underestimated how motivating people find it to know that they're being useful and that they're kind of supporting the business and contributing to the business's success. But then also there's that kind of individual, what's in it for me? This piece of learning is going to support you to do your job quicker or do it easier, and that's going to be really helpful. So yes, it's advertising the learning in a way where people know about it in a campaign, not just a one-off, so that they're being reminded of it, and in a way that where they see what it is and think, oh, actually, that's going to be really helpful to me, and are motivated to take the learning.
Awesome. I've just dropped a couple of links in the chat so people can connect with you on LinkedIn, learn more about Blendible as well if they want to ask any follow-up questions. But Joelle, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cool. We are doing all right for time. We're 1 minute behind where I thought we'd be. So I think we're doing well. So Nelson, over to you if we're ready. Just a quick intro again to sort of who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, sure. I'm one of the founders and CEO at HowNow, and also the author of a book called Learning at Speed. And occasionally I make a guest appearance on your pod.
I've usurped the podcast from Nelson. Nelson, I'm glad you mentioned learning at speed there, because it's made it easier for me to segue into that first question, because there really are risks of not building the skills we need at the speed we need. Whether that's for companies and individuals. So, what are some of those risks of not building skills at the speed required?
Yeah, I guess kind of set the obvious context here. We're living through exponential change. Now, what does that mean? That means it introduces a ton of opportunities and uncertainties. And the organizations who can get the skills to be able to seize those opportunities and navigate those uncertainties fast enough win. And the ones who can't get those skills fast enough lose. And what does losing look like? They struggle to compete, they lose their best talent, often they go bust. And so why is that a concern? Well, right now, the availability of those skills that you need to win is quite low on the market because change is coming about so much. There are very few people with the skills that we need to get those jobs done. And so actually, our biggest concern isn't robots taking our jobs. Our biggest concern is there aren't enough humans with the right skills to get the job done. Now, what does that mean for your organization? It essentially means your organization is going to struggle unless they're really good at developing those skills in-house, which we'll hear from a lot of the conversation and looking at the data, many organizations aren't. It means they're not developing. It's too expensive to buy those skills, which means now they don't have those skills internally, which makes it very hard to drive innovation, to be competitive. Quite simply, you might even struggle to have the skills to get basic work done, which leaves you in quite a tricky position. And that's a very high risk for organizations. And on the flip side, for individuals, if you're not building the skills you need, it becomes very difficult for you to get those jobs that are going to support your lifestyle, to be able to keep up with the changing world. And fundamentally, the risk is you could become socially and economically irrelevant. Now, that's a big problem for the individual, but it's also a big problem for the wider society. We all probably know friends or family members who fall under that bucket and risk not being able to get a competitive job that's going to support that lifestyle and the world they live in today. And so it's a big risk all around.
And you know what, we spoke about numbers right at the start, but there's numbers that support both sides of the argument. There's numbers from companies saying we're worried we're not going to build the skills to perform. There's numbers from individuals saying I'm scared I won't have the skills to perform my job or have a secure future. So it's not that people don't want to be proactive about it and solve it, but they just typically find it a challenge. So what are some of the main reasons people do find it so hard to tackle the skills crisis in an organization?
Yeah, look, we have a history and a track record in learning and education, not just in workplace learning, but overall education. We have a history of doing things not because necessarily they're the most effective thing to do, but because they're the easiest thing to do, right? Like there's a reason why we have someone stood at the front of a lecture hall lecturing 1,000 students, not because it's the most effective way to learn, it's the easiest way to disseminate and distribute information and knowledge. And so the same is true when you come into workplace learning. There's a lot of things we do, not because they're the most effective thing to do, because they're the easier thing to do. And that's the reason why we've kind of shied away in many organizations to tackle the skills crisis, because it's a hard problem to solve, right? Because you've got to figure out, what skills that people should have and need, and what skills do they actually have? How do you bridge those gaps? And you've got to be able to do that in a continuous basis while you've got many moving parts. And so what we've done is we've fallen into the trap of what we would describe as content first approach to learning and development. It's content first because primarily the questions we ask ourselves is what content does this employee need and how am I going to get this content to them? But actually what we should be asking is what skills does this employee need and how am I going to help them build those skills? That's a very different question. And depending on which questions you're answering, you're going to get very different answers, right? So if your entire L&D strategy and your operating model is designed to answer the content first question, then you're going to end up in a position where you're pushing out a lot of content and tracking whether people have completed content and how long they spent to complete that content. But if you're asking the skills question, now you're starting to, going back to the point Joelle mentioned around speaking a language that everyone understands, we're now tracking the metric that the business understands, right? Like the business, let's look at the individual parts of the business. The employee doesn't really care how many pieces of content they've done. They don't really care how many hours. We were speaking to an organization which was targeting their employees to learn 40 hours a month. Do they know what they learned? Do they know what skills they've learned? But it's the most urgency I've seen amongst employees to find out how many hours they've been learning. because you achieve what you measure, right? And so there was no real value to the business, but everyone was clocking in 40 hours because their performance was measured on that. That's the risk. Whereas if we go towards a skills based, now the employee and the C-suite get this. If you go to an employee and say, you don't have skills X, Y, Z to do the job well or to progress in your career, they get that. If you go to the C-suite and say, actually, we don't have the skills to achieve these OKRs or these business goals, they get that. And I think in the move to speak a language the organization understands, it needs to move from being content first to skills first.
Absolutely. And, often people give us the feedback, they kind of like the practical, easy to follow frameworks that come up in sessions like these. But you kind of broke it down before, Nelson, into 3 buckets. Can you kind of talk us through the sort of short version of what those 3 buckets are, how we can approach that?
Yeah, so the first question, and let's break it down to very simple questions, right? The question we're trying to answer is, what skills do people need? Now, Joelle kind of touched on how people have historically done this. I'd go to my managers, I'd ask my managers, what skills should this person have? And typically what will happen is every department thinks they're special. And so they all have their special list of skills, which they're fighting over. And like, no, we call it slightly different to what you call it. So you end up with an amalgamation that goes into a spreadsheet. Whose job is it to keep the spreadsheet up to date? How are they tracking the emerging skills? It's a very, very difficult problem for humans to solve, right? Now, how can we solve this better? I think first we need to really think about that skills architecture. Now, sometimes the misconception is we directly connect jobs to skills, right? But actually, it's not the job that's connected to the skill. It's the tasks that you do as a part of that job role that are connected to skills. And that's a really critical piece. If you're going to drive talent mobility and you're going to redeploy people, reskill people, you need to look at the tasks they're doing and the skills required to do those tasks, not looking at this job role has this skill. It's too binary to look at it in that way. And so this is where we take a combined approach when we work with organizations. Our model has a foundation that's built on the World Economic Forum skills taxonomy. On top of that, we build a job market data model. So we collect and analyze millions and millions of job adverts, track what the most in-demand skills are for any particular job. And that compares it with what's the job, what's the responsibilities and tasks associated with that job, and then making an inference on what skill is required to execute that task, but also what is the required proficiency level to be able to execute that task. And then the layer on top is to track the emerging trends. And this is where we look at things like research papers that are being published. What are the patents that are being filed? Because that gives you an indication of where the world might go in the next few years. Because you don't want your people investing their time in building a skill that's going to be redundant in the next couple of years. Now, you bring all that together, what you end up with is a very dynamic skills ontology. That's building a relationship between the jobs, the tasks, the skills, the required proficiency level. And that's the first step, is to know what skills should this person have and what is the required proficiency level they should have based on the task that they're going to do. Now we need to know, okay, now we know this person needs to be at X. Now we need to know, where are they? And this is where skills assessment or skills measurement is a critical piece. And, it'd be good to look at and maybe hear in the chat, how many people today think their organizations do a good job of assessing and measuring it? It always amazes me how organizations don't measure skills the way they measure any other KPI in their organization. Yet skills is probably one of the most critical KPIs that's going to determine the today and tomorrow of their organization. So how do you measure it? It's a hard thing to do. So our approach to this is there's a couple of different ways. You can take an objective approach. I give you a test and you ace that test, then I make an inference on what proficiency level you have. Now, we don't necessarily believe on that as the sole approach, because just because you aced an exam, it doesn't mean you have the skills to execute it, right? It's a test of knowledge, not a test of skill. Now, a great way of doing this is an evidence-based approach to this, which is where we really recommend a 360 approach to skills measurement. Is the best people to evidence whether you're applying a skill in your day-to-day context are the people I work with, my manager, my colleagues who see my work, they see my performance, and they can see, is Nelson applying this skill within a relevant context or not? Now, where do we see the future of this? This is an area we're really excited about at HowNow. Is 360 is great. You've got the objective assessment. You can start to triangulate based on those. But what AI really opens up as an opportunity for, now that generative AI can see and hear, it can do those observations. It can look at those things that you would have liked, humans doing, to be able to really look at performance data and look at performance in motion to start to infer what that skills assessment is. Now we know where you are. We know where your gaps are. The last question is, how do I bridge this gap? And I think the first thing for us to acknowledge, you're not going to bridge this gap through e-learning and courses, right? If that's the answer that you're thinking, I'm going to throw a course library at this and this is going to bridge this gap, it isn't going to. I think the first thing we need to recognize and acknowledge, most of us here, if I asked you, when was the last time you learned something that had a big impact on your performance and career? And you thought about that, and I asked you, did that take place inside an LMS? I'm pretty certain none of you will put your hand up for saying it took place inside an LMS. That's just as true for every employee who works within your organization. They're learning from books, podcasts, blogs, webinars, speaking to colleagues, mentoring, coaching. The ecosystem is broad and diverse. Now, the thing that we have to do is we need to bring that ecosystem together, but more importantly, we need the ecosystem to speak our skills language, right? This is the problem with having such a diverse ecosystem. They all have their own taxonomies and frameworks, etc., which isn't useful for you, right? If you've got a bunch of different providers and they're all speaking a completely different, skills language, how are you going to align it back to your skills gap? How are you going to build the impact narrative to say that your learning has helped develop the skills that you need, right? You need your ecosystem to speak the same language as your organization. And that's how we help companies do that, is we bring their ecosystem together into a single platform, but we use AI to be able to organize it based on your organization's skills framework. Now you've got your entire organization and ecosystem speaking the same skills language. It becomes easier for me to connect the dots. It becomes easier for me to say, here's the gap, here's the learning opportunity, here's the mentor that's going to help you bridge that gap. Here's that podcast that's going to help you work on this particular skill that you're building expertise around. And so they're the three questions. However you choose to do it, fundamentally, you need to be able to tell what skills people need, what skills do they actually have, and how am I going to bridge that gap?
Awesome. Nelson, thank you very much. You covered off my other question, which was about tech there. So we are bang on time. As with Joelle, I'll just drop 2 links in the chat. One where you can connect with Nelson on LinkedIn if you've got any other follow-up questions, and then just a link to learn about HowNow. Obviously, Nelson mentioned some of the things we're doing and how we work with our customers. So if you'd like to know any more, just go to getHowNow.com. And that means, James, we're over to you. So as with Joelle and Nelson, just give us that sort of 1-minute intro to who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gary. But before I do, I just wanted to say thank you to Joelle and Nelson, actually. So much good stuff covered already. And yeah, it's kind of a hard act to follow. I feel like I'm under a bit of pressure here. But James Griffin coming to you from sunny London today, which makes me smile. I am a consultant and I work for a boutique consultancy called Skill Collective. And our vision and mission really is to simplify the complex world of skills and skills technology for everybody. I think Nelson gave some, and Joelle gave some great understanding into the complexities that exist. So we provide advisory and professional services to help people overcome that.
Perfect. You shared a great quote recently around skills not being the end game. And kind of to similar points to Nelson and Joelle, it's about increased productivity and performance. And you put a great framing around that before we can use skills as a transformative force, we have to understand what that means to both the businesses and the individuals. So talk us through how we can do that.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think, Joelle and Nelson both touched on it. And, skills in themselves could be a bit of a sort of shrug of the shoulders, so what reaction from the business, from individuals in some ways. A bit of a kind of meh, great skills. I think you've got to start talking a business language. And performance and productivity is something that business leaders understand. It's really what they're measured by. So, ask yourself, is skills really something that the wider business kind of cares about, or do we need to actually, start to tell a story which is more, which will resonate closer to how they speak? So, increased performance. There are ways to measure performance. Performance management is a pretty established concept. Um, I won't go down that rabbit hole of how valuable it is these days, but there are metrics for people to use. Increased productivity is relatively simple at a high level. You could just say total revenue divided by number of employees, and is that gonna move the needle? So I think but to come back to the initial part of the question of skills are not the end game. It's not just about developing skills and being able to evidence the development of skills, that a number of people move from a 1 to a 2, a 2 to a 3, a 3 to a 4 on a rubric and a proficiency level, and that we've kind of achieved our job within L&D. That's just not the case. It's about, as Joelle said, solving those cost-cutting issues. It's about providing more female representation, within a business function to actually align with the business strategy. Okay, and once those elements are, starting to move forwards, then I think it's easier for L&D to make claims about the value that they're delivering to the business. It's always been very difficult for L&D to do that. My first step into L&D, I was acquired into a LXP from a more of a TA business, TA software platform, into an L&D LXP provider in America. And I was walking around the place saying, how do we measure value here? What's the success metrics? And as Nelson said, it's like how many hours spent learning, and what was the content consumption and completion metrics. Everyone's obsessed by it, and I was kind of bowled over by that. I was like, there's no, can't infer any value in here. I can't tell a story around that. There's nothing. So for L&D to actually cement their seat of this skills crisis, we've got to start aligning closer to what the business is measured by, and productivity and performance. Very high level, I know there'll be other things, but at a high level, that is what skills are going to enable. That's what development of skills delivers. So measure yourselves on what the business is measured by.
And kind of getting there and getting to that point where you can tell the story, that doesn't happen overnight. And I know your thoughts are, it's a journey, and one of the first steps is just getting organized around skills. So kind of what is that? What is kind of the top level advice for getting more organized as a starting point?
Yeah, it's definitely a journey, we're 100%. I would assume that, many of the attendees, all these lovely faces on the call today, were at Learning Tech a few weeks ago, would have heard, many people talk in the seminars and the conference. One of my colleagues, actually, Gordon Ritchie, was on with Peter Shepherd. Maybe he's known, he's, the CLO at Ericsson. And Peter, who I've met a few times before, he said to the audience, they're 3 years into their skills journey. I actually met Peter before that, and he'd already started his skills journey then, so I know it was actually longer. And they are, they're moving forward on a structured plan, because they know that skills is going to be so transformative, but it takes time. You have to be pragmatic. You cannot just flick the switch and expect things to happen. And there's so many different components to it. Nelson gave a great insight into how technology can help you drive skills forward, but that's the enablement layer, in my opinion. The strategy above that has got to be defined first, but the key to it is really finding a starting point. Don't be afraid to fail and learn. That's how we learn. Don't think you have to paint the Mona Lisa, the Sistine Chapel. You've got to have this amazing solution that is going to be perfect in every way. We've got to be, we've got to look for progress rather than perfection. Think about, what Peter at Ericsson's done. New technology can be great. It can, it can kind of move you forward a bit quicker. But I'd say the initial phase of a skills journey is experimentation. And to do that, you don't necessarily need, you probably got tech, you probably got some data. Joelle showed us some, some free tooling that's available out there. So there are ways for you to build a as Nelson said, skills to role mapping isn't the entire solution, but it's not a bad starting point. Understanding the tasks and how they're put to work I'm a huge advocate of that. So I love what you said there, Nelson. That's critical. Skills is really the supply, the task is the demand. How do they meet in the middle? But find a starting point. Find stakeholders that genuinely have a problem that you think skills can solve, and go after that. Iterate after that, learn and scale. You don't have to go org wide, wall to wall. It'll be overwhelming. It'll be terrifying. So just start somewhere where you think you've got a higher chance of success, good stakeholder engagement, good relationships, maybe, better sets of data integrity and veracity, and then move forward from there. Don't try and boil the ocean with a kettle from day one. So a lot of organizations talk about being agile. Be agile. It's a great opportunity to pursue some agile methodology.
Yeah. If anyone wants a good example of this, if they're not already subscribed to our newsletter on LinkedIn, shared something around this today where someone I spoke to went in to revamp their performance review process and realized it was very dated and it would need to kind of be built up from scratch again, and use that as a way to pilot skills. So actually, what if we started having a conversation about skills in the performance review? So there's kind of some practical advice in there. And another point that person made to me was around how you can build clarity around what skills means internally. And I think this speaks to your point of getting organized, because I know when we spoke before, you explained that actually having more clarity around skills in general can impact people in terms of their performance. So yeah, just tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I think clarity is often missing, isn't it, in the workplace? I think, we talk about ambiguity, and I see so many job ads and job descriptions which say, the ability to handle ambiguity, and it kind of grates me a little bit. I'm like, why don't you remove the ambiguity rather than expecting people to be able to handle it? But that's the world we live in. So if you talk about clarity from a role perspective, then I think you're starting to really provide something useful to the human being. We're all humans, and we want to be given the tools to be able to do our job to the best of our ability, and we know that doesn't happen. So role clarity and skills can really help in defining what skills I need in the role. Again, as Nelson said, I need to know how those skills are put to work in the shape of tasks and activities. But on the skills side, if we provide role clarity, then maybe I'm less anxious. Maybe my anxiety, drops, and my performance, my productivity improves. Okay, so look at it on a mental health, on a human level. We're all human beings. So that's kind of right skilling, which is a word that I don't hear too often anymore. I think kind of reskilling and upskilling are dominating. But I think right skilling in your current role is going to untap latent productivity and performance. And I believe we can do that through providing that role clarity. Now, that role clarity isn't necessarily just the responsibility of L&D. Role clarity through talent acquisition and onboarding. If you have that role clarity from the very first time you engage with that brand, oh, there's a job here at HowNow, and this is what it wants. These are the skills that I need to be able to perform in that role. Then actually my journey from candidate to employee experience is enhanced, and the ability for me to onboard faster, be productive quicker, increase my productivity threshold, and possibly stay longer is enhanced through that role clarity. So there, the cost of hiring, the cost per hire, all the KPIs that TA are obsessed with, they are measured in, they're expensive. They are big numbers, particularly for large global organizations. So if you're going to get a bigger return on your investment through TA, TM, L&D, and provide that golden thread of skills through your organization, then I think role clarity is a great opportunity for L&D to partner with other parts of HR, but B, more importantly, in my opinion, of considerable value to the individual.
Yeah, kind of marrying that with what was mentioned throughout the session, having clarity on the skills you need will also put you more at ease in terms of that, am I going to be relevant in the future? And actually, the data I mentioned earlier, another part of the same study is that people and organizations lacked clarity around who owns skills. So actually, you can remove that kind of anxiety for both sides of the aisle if you just do that simple
There's
first
an
step.
interesting point there, Gary, actually, on that ownership element. And I wrote a piece on this on LinkedIn, actually. I don't think anybody owns it. I think the individuals own the skills data. I think certain parts of HR and certain parts of the organization might steward that data and do certain things with it at certain points. But I think the concept of ownership around it, you know, like TA owns the skills data, they're quite a powerful function within, you know, have been. Does strategic workforce planning own the data? No, they're probably the guys who are, you know, empowered to, you know, get value out of skills from a kind of forecasting and headcount planning. There's different areas of it, and I don't think anybody owns it. I think, you know, as individuals, we own our own data, and I think the benefit to the organization is they have the aggregated view of all of that to be able to do some really cool stuff with it.
Awesome. Just a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you if there's any real actionable piece of advice you'd give for people to take away and apply today.
It's already been said, actually, but speak to the business. I think, you know, Joelle kicks us off brilliantly by saying that. And it's so often overlooked to actually, you know, get out there and engage with, you know, stakeholders, try and find out what's keeping them awake at night, understand what key problems they need to solve, and you'll uncover a lot of stuff. It's you know, it's the opportunity for L&D to stop being like order takers, if you like. There's been some posts around that recently on LinkedIn that they're a bit like McDonald's sometimes, that somebody comes up and says, I need this, I need this, I need this. And, you know, sometimes that may be what you need to do. But if you're going to be strategic and you're going to add value to those core business metrics, then you have to get out there and you have to talk to your business stakeholders to find out what problems they need to solve. Then, you know, you can do your analysis and then you can do your solutioning. And as Nelson said, it's not just about content. Content is not king in L&D anymore, or queen. It's about the opportunity to develop my skills in a multitude of ways. So I think, you know, think outside of that content box, and you know, the opportunities for people to develop skills on the job, experiential learning, gigs, projects within mobility, whatever, they're real, they happen. Now we have the opportunity to measure them with skills. So it's not just about it happening and saying, oh yeah, well, Gary's done the, you know, side of the desk project over the road with somebody else for a couple of months. Well, why did he do it? What did he achieve? What was the outcome? And actually taking some ownership of that within L&D and being able to measure that value has got to be a great opportunity, right?
100%. James, thank you so much. I've dropped your links to your profile on LinkedIn and Skill Collective on LinkedIn as well. So if people want to connect with you, they have any questions, please do that. Just a reminder, look, we might not get to questions, but if you do have any, you can drop them in the chat here because I will export it afterwards. Or if you don't want to do it anonymously, you can always just drop me a DM on LinkedIn and then we can kind of combine the questions together and get some answers maybe after. So just a reminder, if you have got any questions, you can share those. And Nick, last but by no means least, because you're joining us all the way from Australia, where it's quite late at night. Thank you for
greetings from down under. Happy to be the token Aussie in the room. But yeah, thanks for having me. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here and fascinating listening. Yeah.
Awesome. Kick us off like everyone else did, Nick, with a quick intro to who you are.
Nick's my name. Based in Melbourne, Australia. I'm a senior specialist lead at Deloitte and head of the learning innovation for Deloitte Learning Studio. Prior to Deloitte, running most of their sort of bespoke design strategy studios. Both here and other places in the world. Been in design for about 23 years, and about half of that have been dedicated to learning. Probably pretty different than most others I meet in L&D in the sense that when people ask me what I do, I tell them I'm a design-based researcher working at the intersection of learning design, strategy, and systems and complexity. So I definitely appreciate there's some people are really good at distilling things. A big part of my role is to go as deep into the complexity as we can, and to prototype our way out of there or through there, to really try and find those very edges and those frontiers for learning. Yeah, so it's kind of me in a nutshell.
Perfect.
Yeah.
We heard a little bit already around this idea of aligning skill development with specific job tasks, but I'd really love to hear your take on that, Nick.
Yeah. So I think job tasks, I mean, how do you frame it? So skills are definitely the future, right? But job tasks are actually the currency that's going to get everything there, right? Skill by skill. And so I think really the idea of moving away from content consumption, which we've heard, and towards this concept of participation, right, is really the key to skill development. And I think, shifting away from traditional cognitive learning outcomes and towards job task mapping. It's really interesting listening to some conversations, particularly the piece around the skill fight, right? Which definitely happens because you go, okay, let's do communication, right? And you're like, yeah, but hold on, which part of the value chain are we talking about here? Because it's going to change in the customer facing end, it's going to change behind the scenes. So job tasks are absolutely key. And, we've had plenty of experiences where we might map a particular skill, and actually there's 3 variations of that skill pretty strongly across, say, a single organization or a single value chain. As they say, like a soft skill is just a hard skill out of context, right? The question I think that I'm sort of have been asking is it even possible to have a skill that does not correlate to job tasks in an organization? That is, are you even able to practice that skill? Are you even able to truly measure that skill? Is there any skill imperative of a skill that doesn't correlate to job tasks? Yeah, and job tasks being flexible, I guess. We go a hardcore safety context for a second. Yeah, job tasks probably should be locked down and sequential and, X, Y, and Z. But if we go to a knowledge worker context, perhaps job tasks are, movable. Maybe we can pick and prioritize and adapt on those things. So, yeah. And I think, maybe just on the job task front as well, with it being potentially the smallest atomic particle of work, which makes it very interesting. Based on our sort of, or my key research, it seems as though job tasks are changing faster than skills. So if you sort of think about that for a second, right? What should we be doing? Should we be focusing on skills or should we be focusing on job tasks? And one of the key approaches we've been taking is kind of not worrying about the skills, and starting with the job tasks and using those job tasks to actually form the skills.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a reverse approach that we found, pretty interesting. And I think definitely is a relatively new in the sense of putting it into practice out there, and is really fascinating listening to some of your perspective there, Nelson, as well. I think I think we're opposite sides of the world, but similar thoughts. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the
Yes.
value chain there, and that does make sense when you say that, because if you know how the company makes revenue, for example, along the value chain, you can work back and see what tasks are needed to create that value, and then you can take a step back again and work out the skills that are needed, I guess.
Yeah. There's another aspect to it as well. Maybe I should skills have a life cycle. Obviously sunset, sunrise, core, and emergent, right? And that's one part of it. But I think also what's really interesting with skills is I call it the tilt that you give the skill. So what is the purpose of this skill? Because it's probably definitely not to communicate, right? It's kind of like pretty useless. I feel it's like, okay, is the purpose of this skill to create assurance? Is it to create stability? Is it to create differentiation, competitiveness? So if you took, I don't know, prompt engineering, for example, right? And you dragged it around this little matrix between growth and stability and competitiveness and so on and so on, what you sort of find is it actually starts to click with the value chain. So if we were going to do prompt engineering in business development, What's the purpose of that skill? Oh, it's about growth and differentiation. But what about something like, I don't know, auditing? What's the purpose of prompt engineering in auditing? Well, it's probably more about stability, potentially about compliance. So the tilt you give the skill based on sort of what its actual purpose is, I think dramatically changes what the job tasks are.
Cool.
And I think that's something we need to do kind of more of, is actually intentionally position skills with intent, and not, just sort of drop skills in there with generic tasks.
Yeah. That kind of links to something we didn't discuss directly, but you need the right culture in a business to cultivate the building of new skills. So you need a good mindset around skills. You need a good perception around it. So, I guess what are some of the tips on creating a culture that does support the building of skills and I guess has everyone steering in the same direction?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And this is where I think complexity, which I don't feel is practiced that much in learning and development, but complexity is a science. It's not just really a way of kind of thinking. And there's many ways to think about complexity, like a bunch of jellyfish in a jar, and there you go. That's an organization. It's messy. It's really, really messy. But when you zoom out and you start to look at this stuff, there's some very interesting principles. One of the principles is that you really can't change your system. You can really just try to influence the way in which it interacts with itself. So if you sort of think about that, it's pretty interesting, because that means, like, okay, so putting in new technology, creating a new room, having a new, a bit of infrastructure, polishing learning so that we've got marketing, these types of things, I think are great, but they actually don't necessarily create the change. The change is really, I think, back to this principle that learning has more to do with relationships than it does to do with content. And so we really need to be thinking about, when we're thinking about learning and change and skills, of creating the right kind of environment that actually induces or amplifies rather than dampens the right types of interactions at scale. And so one of the, I think, opportunities we have in this new era that started a couple of years ago with skills, I feel, is like a regenerative one, which is like, if anyone sort of looked into regenerative design and sort of what it's really focused on, it's really focused on healing. So it's moving away from fixing and towards this kind of concept of healing, right? Which, yeah, sounds pretty out there. And I do love hugging trees and whatnot, right? But the idea is, like, can we build a learning culture that actually heals the relationship of learning between managers and learners, right? And what does that look like, right, as a native behavior inside of that organization? And things get really, really interesting at that level, and I won't go into, I probably already have, but I won't go too far down the rabbit hole of narrative enhanced practice. But to touch on that a little bit, you can't really measure a culture in numbers. Numbers just don't hold trans-contextual information, right? They're just not built for that. So really, a way to think about working with complexity and cultures is actually to measure narrative. I'll just give you a very quick example of this. Okay, diversity and inclusion, right? Something hopefully everyone kind of gets. If we went around an organization and we surveyed for the stories that people had to tell around their lived experiences of diversity and inclusion inside of the culture, we'll be able to pull a lot of stories. And through those stories, we'll be able to potentially categorize those stories into stories we ideally want to hear more of and stories we want to hear less of. And then what we can do is go, okay, this little cluster of stories over here, we're going to circle that, and that's going to be our first small, probable, measurable experiment. We might design skills and change the environment, change relationships, so on, and let that run, put it in the oven, so to speak, come back and remeasure those narratives to see if those narratives have changed. And it's the change between the narratives or the story points of the organization. And those narratives can come from different people. They don't have to be from the same people, right? And that, I think, is a real way to, we're talking about that bigger, broader, creating the right conditions, the sort of more systems type environment level. Yeah, getting to that narrative level is really, really key. And it's definitely more than a survey. It requires, yeah, it's quite effortful, but I mean, if you want to do it, you do it properly, right? So
Yeah, 100%. I guess like not everything is, well, we spoke about context quite a few times, and numbers alone don't necessarily have all the context that you mentioned there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and something on context that I picked up on recently, actually over in the UK, was I was doing some warm data research stuff over there, and one of the things we dived into is the idea of warm data versus cold data. Right, cold data is context or data really that's kind of been ripped out of context and put into something else. It's had everything cut off, right, and so it's sort of frozen in time from wherever it came. Warm data is this idea of sort of like living data or like trans-contextual data. It's data that has multiple kind of contexts connected to it. And I think, you know, when we think about what learning is, it is really a living thing. It is not really a static thing when we think about cultures and when we think about narrative. And so I think one of the kind of next curbs for learning and for L&D and alike is embracing some of that complexity and some of that narrative work into what we're doing. So it's not just about hard-boiled you know, skill acquisition numbers, completion numbers, engagement numbers, right? And maybe, you know, we can talk on this a little bit, you know, in a minute or two, but one of the broader shifts in all of that, I feel, is actually moving away from like respective analysis, which is pretty much the industry standard, which is basically design, train, measure, right? We put people through training, we come back a little bit later and we ask them how they went and assess them. And by that point, it's too late anyway. It's not like we're going to put them back through training again. So the shift is actually one of monitoring as a form of evaluation. So rather than that kind of respective analysis method, monitoring as evaluation is quite different. That means what we do is we actually monitor what's happening in real time. So one of the things we're doing on that front is monitoring the completion of job tasks or the volume of completion of job tasks in relation to a skill in real time. And what that tells us is, you know, if 3 months ago we figured out this skill was live or die by because it's affecting revenue, well, guess what? We enrolled 400 people. It's been there for 3 months. There's 23 tasks in it, and the adoption rate's been 0.03%. What does that tell you? We do not have that skill as an organization, right?
Yeah.
And so now we need to intervene, and now we can act, and now we can pivot. We could maybe tweak the tasks. We could maybe go down the communications campaign. We can maybe investigate further. And that, I think, is the power and the difference between taking a monitoring as evaluation approach as opposed to the respective analysis approach. Yeah.
I know we're just coming to time, but same question I kind of asked to James. Is there any kind of quick, practical piece of advice you give for people to take away and go and apply?
Yeah. See if you can map the job tasks for one skill. Yeah. You'll be fascinated. Go and ask your leaders, hey, what are the 16 job tasks of business development? And they'll go, meh. And pretty soon you'll figure out nobody knows. No one really knows what people have actually been doing in their organizations. And you'll come to probably the same conclusion that I did, which is like, hold on a second, what have we been doing this entire time? But it's a really nice little challenge. Yeah, that's right. There's 30,000 skills, right? And no job tasks. It's literally a bit like, yeah, but I would, yeah, just really recommend trying to do that just for a really simple skill. Just see how you go in your organization, and then I reckon that could be a quite an insightful you know, journey for you. And last little piece, I think the interesting thing about job tasks, they don't transfer that well between organizations is something that I've learned. So your job tasks are going to be your job tasks. They are so nuanced and contextualized often that yeah, it's going to be a bit of a discovery journey. Yeah, so that's what I'll say for that.
Well, two brilliant things to end on, because if you do it a few times and then you build a better process, then you can scale the right stuff. And I think we've alluded to that. And yeah, I think it's just a sort of great note to end on. There's a few people, and actually there's a kind of follow-up question to that around giving a real example of one skill to one task. Is there anything that, maybe not example-wise, but somewhere you recommend is a typical good starting point for mapping that out, that very first one?
Yeah, business development is that's my favorite. My underwater basket weaving is my other one I often go to in a training context. Oh, look, think of the skill that's closer to the customer. I think if you're in a customer centered business, go for the skill that's closest to the customer, such as what are the very first steps that happen when a customer through customer acquisition. So whether that's business development, something along those lines, that's a really good starting place. Like essentially go to your front door of your organization and follow the skills in the door, right? That's what I would recommend. And look, a really good example of like a job task is literally like, what are the 16 things, right, that you do as part of the business development process, right, that if done well and with mastery, lead to the desired outcomes, which is probably a sale, right? So one of them might be, writing for client understanding. So the client sent you a brief. Now you have to write back in your own words so that you can show you understand what they're saying and that you have something to offer. It's a job task. Yeah.
Brilliant. There's still quite a few people here, so I didn't know if there were any final things anyone wanted to share. We found this last time, actually. We could extend this session by, I think, to an hour and a half if we wanted to. But yeah, guys, like kind of open final advice. And like I said, I'll just collate the questions and maybe try and follow up. But yeah, James, Joelle, Nelson, was there anything else you kind of wanted to share before we wrap up?
It was really nice to see how kind of everything that we talked about between the four of us kind of flowed down the same line, and is showing that it's becoming quite obvious that L&D need to make this shift into becoming very business focused and kind of goal orientated to be able to address that skills crisis.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd just underscore that from Joelle. I think that was my main takeaway today. Hope it wasn't too repetitive for people, but I think it is very indicative that, you know, the alignment with business strategy and all those things that we've mentioned is critical. Not going to solve this problem in a silo by shouting outwards. It's not going to happen.
100%. And Nelson, for yourself?
Yeah, I saw a question that came up earlier in the chat around, how do I bring my stakeholders on board? Or how do you change the mindset? Is often, I know you can come to these things and it sounds very theoretical and you're walking away going, well, I'm going to have to go push that course out and track whether people have completed it. So my reality is quite different. And I think it's right to point out there is a mindset and a cultural shift, but I don't think it's a leap, because the fundamental question, let's ask, do you think your boss or the powers above, do you think you get to keep your job if you continue not to deliver any value and you just push out hundreds and hundreds of courses? At some point, someone's going to wake up and go, hold up, what have you done for the business? And what you want to do is act before that question gets asked of you, right? And the reality is it shouldn't take a lot to move people on that journey, because you're saying, actually, I can carry on doing this thing, but it will have no value on the business. Or you can give me a bit of time to pivot and move this around to a place where you can start to see more value for your money, right? And that's the conversation we need to have, rather than more output. Are we driving the desired outcome?
Awesome. Brilliant. Well, thank you all for joining me again. I think this was a format that really worked and resonated. So thank you everyone for joining and engaging in the chat, because I think that was really nice to see